All right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our third Dean's Digital Cafe of fall 2023. I'm William Letzu. I'm an assistant professor in biological and chemical sciences here at NYIT. On behalf of Dean Quigley and of the College of Arts and Sciences, I'd like to thank all New York Tech students, faculty, staff, alumni, and guests for tuning into today's event. So I'd like to remind everyone that the talk is being recorded. We'll be taking questions following the presentation, but feel free to enter your questions or comments into the chat at any time. And I'd also like to invite you to join our Dean's Digital Cafe Canvas course, which I'm posting in the chat, where you can watch recordings of today's event and past events, of which we have so far. And so before introducing Professor Fiano, I'd like to acknowledge the land. The Long Island campus of New York Tech sits on the larger territory known as Pominoke, which was home to numerous indigenous communities, including the local tribes of the Mattincocks and the Merricks. I'd like to acknowledge the land, the stewardship and sovereignty of the native peoples, and their enduring importance, even in this virtual environment, to our work and community here today. And now I'm pleased to introduce Professor Alex Fiano. Alex recently joined New York Tech in Humanities, where they teach ethics and social philosophy. Alex is a licensed lawyer in the state of New York, but has numerous other interests, including art, religion, LGBTQ+ issues, and has conducted research on best teaching practices for underserved college students. Alex is also the author of Gabriel Ross, a queer fiction mystery e-thriller book series, which you can read more about here. Today, Alex will be telling us about their human rights arts project, entitled Exploring Mental Health Through Art and Critical Thinking. So welcome, Alex. Thank you for joining us today at New York Tech's Dean's Digital Cafe. We are excited to hear more.
Thank you so much, William. Thank you all for being here. I deeply appreciate this. And let me just go ahead and start sharing my PowerPoint before I forget to do so. First thing you always got to do in class. And welcome, and thank you for the acknowledgement of the land too. I always appreciate that. So I'm Alex Fiano, and that was a terrific introduction. I appreciate that. I'm so glad to be part of the Dean's Digital Cafe. And I thank the Dean, thank Professor Letzu, and also Lyubov and Sobnom for helping out with this project. One of the primary goals here is touching upon mental health, which I still feel is very important in our post-pandemic society. And I created this presentation first. I had gone back to Hunter College to study studio art and art history. And this was part of a Mellon Humanities project in their program. And I wanted to revise it and look at connections again between art and mental health and critical thinking to provide some ideas and inspiration to continue conversations about using art in museums and critical thinking as a teaching tool. And so what I'm talking about here, it's connected, but I just invite any part of this that is useful, please feel free to take it or adapt it or think about it. And I'm always, up for a conversation on these things. Let's see.
So, Alex, before you continue, we're seeing your presenter view, not the slideshow view.
Okay. Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Let me remind myself.
Sometimes it's like a tiny little button at the bottom. There we go.
How we doing?
There we go. That looks better. Thank you.
I got you. When it gets time to putting in those links, I may have to jump out of this view.
Okay.
Not always the fastest at doing that, but we're all.
That's okay.
We're all still
no rush right now.
Users. Okay, so As I found out being a teacher, and in particular, some years ago in teach-ins, I was doing a lot of talking about LGBTQ topics, and you never know the impact you may have or who you may help, particularly with your students. And I think always one person listening and saying, as I've had students on occasion approach me and say, "I'm so glad you mentioned that topic. I hadn't heard someone, bring that up before." And so there's some things in our social issues that we still need to raise visibility and normalcy about that. And I'm using the context of art because I believe in humanities and how humanities can give us insight into the world, and how artistic images are so powerful as a catharsis for such. Okay. So I wanted to start first with some mental health facts, and these are from the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMI, a credible website from the US government. Nearly 1 in 5 adults has some form of a mental condition. So that's 57.8 million people in 2021. And the NIMH defines this as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that can vary in impact, maybe from practically no impact to severe impact. And that's 57 million people in the country. It tells us that mental conditions, mental illness is common, it's everyday, it's part of life, and it's on a continuum. And that varies quite often from public perception of what we see about mental issues and mental conditions and how common they are. Now, the NIMI has a particular definition between any mental illness and AMI, which is defined as a behavioral or mental emotional disorder that can be mild or moderate, and that which is severe, which is called serious mental order. That's where it rises to the level of a disability, where it can interfere with a major life activity. So a few other stats about that. First we have the 57 million adults 18 or older who have some form of AMI. It's higher among women than men. It's higher among adults aged 18 to 25 than those 26 to 49 and those 50 and older. It's higher among adults who have 2 or more races, followed by Native persons and Alaska Native adults. And there are, out of those 57 million adults, 26 million, less than half, received mental health services. So more women than men received mental health services. And the percentage of young adults 18 to 25 receiving mental health services was lower than those 26 to 49 or age 50 and older. So, that makes us think of our student cohort. Those are the ones who have it highest, but don't get as much mental health services probably as they should. Now, I looked further into the college students' rates, and the rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation have all increased among college students. The utilization of mental health services has risen. And I also looked into trans and non-binary people because right now the US government site doesn't have that. It was divided into men and women. And as a trans non-binary person myself, I always like to check into those stats. They're a little bit more difficult to find, but there was a pilot study for some college students, 2021 to 2022, that said about 68% described their mental health as being fair or poor. And those who had disabilities were likely to self-report more of a negative mental health status. But I also wanted to emphasize that it wasn't about them being trans or gender diverse. It was more about how they were treated in society and the challenges they ran into. I just wanted to add that because too often there are people who assume that a trans or non-binary person has mental health issues because of their identity rather than how society is reflecting back on them. So the next thing I wanted to move to was from mental health into using language about mental health. I do a lot of creative writing, so language matters. And I use the terms mental illness and mental condition interchangeably. And I wanted to point out that there are different ways to refer to people with disabilities, whether they're physical disabilities or psychological. And people first language is very popular right now because it prioritizes the person over the condition. So people with disabilities, but there are still people who prefer to say disabled persons. So, you find out what individuals like. People with disabilities, me being one myself, it's not all one mindset, much like LGBTQ people, not all one mindset. People have different ways of describing each other, but I go with the person first language because of highlighting the person. And I use mental conditions and mental illness because I don't believe these are things that should be swept away or hidden. I was just talking to my students in my social ethics course about issues with disability and mental illness and the stigma that surrounds it. And one of the sites I recommend for more information, you all may already know this, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, they have a lot of advocacy and information for people. And because I'm going to touch upon art and artists, I'd also like to know there are artists out there with disabilities, but not all of them want to be acknowledged or identified as having a disability. And that's why whenever you're utilizing art in a course, to look into the artist and see how they want to identify themselves. Some of them use disability in art and some don't. But when talking about it, to have a balanced presentation, not to get into what's called inspiration porn or the charitable model to inspire pity, look what a good job such and such has done, but rather deal with the realistic acknowledgement of challenges, but add to the nuances of a person's life for a richer depiction of that artist. And that is one of the ways to connect with any students or audience members or so on, to show that everyone's life has a lot of subtext and meaning and nuance, and isn't just this or isn't just that. And that's important for combating stigmatization and to encourage empathy. I also want to go into mental health as a human right because it's important to touch upon that again. To connect to advocacy for mental health acknowledgement and treatment. I teach about human rights quite often. As again, I was just had a lesson for that for my students this week. And I use the United Nations materials like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in Article 25 says everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of themselves and their families, including medical care and social services. The UN has said that one of the most basic challenges to mental health is stigma and discrimination. And the World Health Organization contends that social stigma continues to be a barrier to seeking and receiving treatment for mental health difficulties. Now, in terms of art, I just wanted to mention, I'm a huge movie lover and also a book lover. And quite often in fictional works, mental conditions are mischaracterized. I'm looking at you, M. Night Shyamalan. And this becomes part of an unconscious dialogue. And even in your favorite Law and Order shows, they're not always accurate about how mental illness is portrayed. But when that's what you see on film and TV or in the news, that's what people tend to think, that having anxiety or depression or other issues like schizophrenia, what that's all about. And I don't expect something to instantly solve problems, but I just want to encourage others to find opportunities for conversations and advocacy, to take something one step at a time, to discuss, to destigmatize a little bit and to find workable ways to address and advocate. And so here is where I take a little break. I do this in my lectures too, because, I find after somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, it helps them to take a couple of minutes break, give them something to think about. So here is where I've got to jump out of the presentation view to make sure I do this right and find the chat, okay? And find, let's see, I've got to find my poll. Here we go. All right, here's hoping this works. So what I'm doing in this little break is sharing a poll question. This goes to Poll Everywhere, and the question is, let's see, I've got to find my, sorry, I've kind of lost my PowerPoint somewhere. Okay, I apologize. But, there's always tech issues. Okay, I'll find my PowerPoint again. There we are. So, as I was saying, this is a question: have you recently seen a mischaracterization or negative portrayal of a mental or emotional conditions in a fictional work? And if you remember the name, I'd be interested to hear it. So I'm going to time this for a couple of minutes. I have some royalty-free music, and actually I'm just going to share this again because I want to make sure that I click share sound. Yeah, okay. So it's interesting, this royalty-free. Make sure it's not too loud. There we go. All right. So, hey, got something to work. So I have a little timer here for 2 minutes if anyone would like to respond to that poll. I'm always interested in characterizations of mental health conditions. The only odd thing about having the music is that it goes into the closed captioning and you see these random words coming up that are translated from the music. All right, that's actually supposed to read thank you for your response, but that's all right. Let me get back into the regular slide. Thank you all for responding to that question. All right. And now I'm going to move to the first real connection here, which is looking at museums and mental health. I'm obviously a huge fan of museums, and I had a wonderful time as an intern in the Rubin Museum of Art, which I'd recommend going to visit. It's incredibly beautiful, and doing some tours there on Buddhist and Hindu art from Tibet and the Himalayas. So one of the things I found in doing the research for the Mellon Humanities Project was this program that took place in North Wales in 2012. And it was a partnership between some museums and galleries to offer art viewing sessions for persons who were experiencing stress or had mental health issues. And the Welsh program resulted in this impact on mental well-being to help alleviate the depression, anxiety, and stress from the people who participated in it. And the people who participated reported that the museum setting for them was inspirational, calming, increased awareness of a visually rich environment, that it enabled connections between past and present for them, that it allowed for an experience of a connection to humanity and a cathartic emotional response. And then there was another report of a program that the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto had in conjunction with area health centers. And they were offering free museum passes to people with the motivation between the health centers and the museum that there was research that engaging with art and culture was beneficial for people with mental health conditions and some physical conditions. And the results showed that this contact with art and culture through the museums offset social isolation. This was in 2019. And it improved physical and mental well-being. So it really shows as an inspiration for future programs that could be started elsewhere, particularly as isolation is still an issue in society. And these experiences, very restorative, have the potential to contribute to well-being and satisfaction of those who participate in them. And it's highly relevant to positive psychology and emotional and cognitive functioning and well-being for individuals in society and communities. So I hope that some other places will take inspiration for those. And the next connection is museums as a teaching tool, moving from museums for mental health to museums as a teaching tool about mental health and disability. I was specifically looking to see, had there been any use of museums to teach about mental health? I interviewed the directors of a US-based online National Museum for Mental Health project, Paul Pucco and Alexandra Orlandi, and they described for me the results of their research on exhibits on mental health and illness. And from the data they have, the exhibits that had taken place were favorable with regards to individual visitors and community perceptions about mental health. And this again helped normalize mental health as a topic and reduce stigmatization. So as an example, visitors expressed positive emotional reactions and found, again, personal connections and engagements with the exhibits. And for these directors, Pucco and Orlandi, they found that they believe that museums should be encouraged to develop more mental health exhibits and education programs. And I also interviewed a wonderful man, Professor Richard Sandell of the United Kingdom Research Center for Museums and Galleries over in England. And he believes museums are a useful source of education on social issues like disability, which he focused in, and mental health, because they're a credible source and they're a mirror of society, providing a window into history and also contemporary concerns. But he did note a concern of his was that they still don't offer enough representation of people with disabilities. So he described for me a program that he had participated in Birmingham Museum of Art, which was talking about disability in art that used some paintings that had already been in the collection. And some of them had some type of depiction of disability, but when they were on exhibit, they were never used for disability as a topic. So what this program did was bring in some professionals and artists with disabilities who critiqued these works, and the museums then provided those critiques and also other works like poems and anecdotes in audio and visual form for future visitors to use in conjunction with looking at the works, to get a whole new perspective on the topic. Now, in terms of exhibits, it's actually fairly rare for anything to be on psychological disabilities or mental health. The American Alliance of Museum reported about 150 instances in 2013. I believe that's the most recent I could find that had health topics, but only 3 of those concerned mental health, and none of them were in exhibits, like a special exhibit. The one exception that has gone around the country is one called Mind Matters, and that's from the Science Museum of Minnesota, which went on tour in 2018 and 2021. And it was originally created by Heureka, the Finnish Science Center in Vantaa, Finland. And this provided, as I said, a safe place for important conversations about mental illness and family-friendly interactive displays to talk about mental illness with activities such as to write down one's worries and destroy them with a worry shredder. And they also had resources and personal stories from people who had psychological disabilities. Another one of my interviewers, Philip Janos from John Jay College, told me he believed this exhibit was beneficial, Mind Matters, because it connected the audience to the topic with personal stories. And that again helps for an anti-stigma message and to enable visitors empathy. And this is a science exhibit rather than art. And science and art can sometimes have different appeal and different audiences. There are some art-based presentations, most particularly the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And that one, of course, centers around Vincent. And with Vincent's story, the way they have it set up, as Professor Janos described it to me, is that it's a full story about him, so that he is more than just his mental illness, but not just his genius, but also the stories of his life, the stories of his friendship, to see him honestly and realistically through photographs, through letters, through paintings, and all of this was weaved together so that a visitor can have so much more of a complete picture to understand him, but still appreciate the various struggles that he did go through. Now, with art and learning, having made a connection here, I hope for mental health, for museums, and the potential of museums as a teaching tool, I wanted to touch a bit more about the importance of art, how art can help in learning about mental health. And that's because art connects to us all on such an emotional level. And what struck me in doing research was something that curator James Cuno said in 2002 to recognize how art museums were a safe space after 9/11. And he said people came to museums in surprisingly large numbers, maybe because for stranded tourists there was little else to do, but also because people wanted to be there in the company of others, looking at rare and beautiful things, and the museums responded appropriately. So aside from being such a restorative environment, there are some studies that seem to strongly indicate that art stimulates brains and minds and feelings. Professor Samir Zeki, a chair in neuroaesthetics at the University College in London, found that the brain goes through these positive changes in looking at art, increasing blood flow by as much as 10%. And another study found that museum visits increase critical thinking, increases historical empathy, and tolerance. And so all of this goes to make evidence that art museums make an engaging teaching tool for discussing social topics like disabilities and mental health, but not limited to that, of course, and help in empathy to address stigma and discrimination. So my point in connections here is art and museums being beneficial to mental health and being a good teaching tool. And then I wanted to touch a little bit more on critical thinking, in particular, emotional intelligence. And we usually define emotional intelligence as the ability to be aware of and manage our emotions, to interact with the world around us. And to me, as I like to have a whole week for critical thinking with my students in the ethics class. And I tell them about neuroplasticity, the ability to build, new neural pathways in your mind, to develop new ways of thinking and habits, from metacognition to think and reflect on your practices, on how you deal with the world at large, with mindfulness, to be aware of your thoughts and actions, and also observation, active listening, asking questions, and emotional intelligence, which, as psychologist Daniel Goleman points out, or he has this mixed model in which he says emotional intelligence generally involves self-awareness, self-management, empathy, motivation, and social skills, which I think are very important. And I like to lead those into the idea of catharsis for including museums. I'm including in art this sort of an ad hoc categorization of art that has a cathartic effect and art that has a restorative effect. And to catharsis, that which a person experiences or appreciates or finds something they can relate to due to something in their own life to kind of help them process it. Like if having struggles of a mental condition. I know the scream is too often used for that, but it still resonates to this day. And then something that's restorative, something that has a particular joy to it, a positive feelings and aesthetic joy. And catharsis, as it was in Aristotle's Poetics, is still debated exactly what he meant, but it's often defined as processing emotions when we watch something, particularly a tragedy. And I like to think of it more broadly as finding and connecting with an emotional aspect in some story. And I feel that sometimes we connect to issues better when we can process it through a work of art, like a movie or a book or a game. Sometimes that one level of difference helps to understand something more than confronting it directly. I mean, not with everybody, but I know I find it, that's why I'm drawn to certain books over and over again for an emotional catharsis. So here I'm bringing together the fact that art has a positive effect on the people viewing it, and it has a cathartic effect on people viewing it, as has been known to happen with music, has been shown to have an appeal, something that's aesthetically pleasing and has psychological benefits, even if it's sad music. And there's been a positive relationship between creative arts and outcome, not income. So I wanted to take another brief break, which just jump out here and find my other sorry, it's hard for me to locate here we go. All right. So this is another brief break, and I'm going to put this in the chat. This is another question. And this is something I will ask my students. What is a creative work of any kind? Any artist, writer, movie character, musician, song, book, or show that to you demonstrates emotional intelligence, right? And emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-management, empathy, motivation, social skills, a character that would have said, that person knew how to handle things. So I am once again going to set that on 2 minutes and play a little bit of this music. Yeah, that. Okay. I appreciate any responses for that. And hey, there we go. I'm a big fan because I teach critical thinking so often. I'm a big fan of credible information, and I wanted to add that I feel museums are often underutilized as a resource, as a credible source, not just for art, but there is a lot that they can be used for history, for humanities, for STEM, for anthropology, literature, architecture, medicine, so many topics. And here I'm quoting from David Skorton, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, that more and more the trustworthiness of information is based on the trustworthiness of the source, and that people are more placing trust in museums and libraries, also a favorite place of mine, libraries. Even today, libraries and museums are considered honest purveyors of information for conversation on issues of local and national significance, are dynamic learning hubs, and use the power of art and artifacts to engage, teach, and inspire, to touch lives and transform the way people see the world and each other. So this to me is a trust worth utilizing. And I'd encourage any other teachers to see where you can utilize museums as a credible source. And that leads me to this topic, to bring in the whole crux of connections: art as a teaching tool, museums as a teaching tool, which could be an art gallery, a college art gallery, an arts and culture center, to teach about social topics like mental health. And we are in the right area for this, the right city, the right counties, and so on. And even doing it online is a good exercise. During the pandemic, I had students do museum assignments online. And so I wanted to suggest for teachers to consider including in any assignments possible aspects of life that directly relate to them. That was part of what my colleague and I studied about underserved students, that it would help if they could find assignments that touched upon mental health, or touched upon LGBTQIA issues, or touching upon being an immigrant or a first-generation student, or those who came from difficult circumstances like being a low income. They engage more when assignments have some type of personal meaning to them. And I have done this, and I've had students kind of, who weren't familiar with museums, and would kind of be like, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. And they'd come back to me so excited and say, I didn't know it was actually that great to be in a museum. And of course, there's nothing that kind of touches you more than when a student comes back and they're so excited about having, learned and connected with something. And I've had students research like their national origin in the American Museum of Natural History and things like that. It is just so wonderful. So I just encourage using museums wherever possible, or galleries, or, take advantage of what we have from museums for yourselves, for that positive psychology and mental health benefits. And if possible, advocate, check in with a museum and say, like, is it possible you could have some type of program for mental health like they did with the Royal Ontario Museum, to, encourage people to find that restorative environment. For an assignment in the museum, it's a positive effect from being in a museum as a new place, and it's a credible resource, and it may give them a way to connect to something they hadn't discovered previously. And for a personal activity, again, it's something restorative, something cathartic, something wonderful, whether it's a small gallery or the Met Museum. And it works pretty well, at least in the classes I've had, to integrate some of these experiences and personal experiences and things that students have discovered for themselves. So I have a few materials that you're welcome to take and adapt to use with these, they're on my website. They'll be at the end. And I just have a list here of just a few of the wonderful museums that are in the city. I know I sound like this is paid for by the Museum Council of New York, but really it's just something I've emotionally invested in. And of course, this doesn't even cover the college galleries that we have. So now I wanted to touch upon what you can do for an activity for yourself or for students in going to those museums. And here I'm borrowing a little bit from Vasily Kandinsky, Composition 8 from 1923. I studied him when I was in grad school at Syracuse, and he was the way he used his works to convey spirituality and emotion and a universal visual language of his colors and arts and forms to better the world, to better society. So here again, I'm integrating critical thinking to start with a set of questions. And in particular for students, these are good because not a lot of students, unless they're art history students who have to go to the museum, they're not always used to it and not sure what to do. So I found that giving them a task helps jumpstart the cognitive process, helps dispel any fear or uncomfortableness in order to okay, what do? We start looking, we start asking questions to create a list of questions, to initiate involvement, to focus attention, and to encourage expansive thinking. And here's just a couple of examples of such questions to ask, again, using Kandinsky. What's going on? What do you notice that speaks to mental health? And of course, you could swap out mental health for another topic, so maybe something more specific like joy, or maybe something more related to your particular class topic. You could, get them to look at it carefully and say, what elements to you represent emotions in this work? What represents empathy, intelligence, perseverance? How would you connect to these colors and shapes? How do you see the symbolism of emotional intelligence here? What is cathartic about observing them, and so on. The purpose of the questions is to get them to engage with the works and find something for themselves. And I would also hope that you note that there aren't wrong answers there, because of course art is always subjective, and as a reflection it's more about self-discovery. And to go with that is also observation. Now here I'm adapting from David Perkins' 1994 work, The Intelligent Eye, which was about going into a museum and observing work. And I'd also recommend Amy Herman's book. I believe she works at the Frick. And this was called Visual Intelligence, that discusses using observation of art to practice sharpening your professional skills. So that's in a tour or just walking through a museum, we only spend about a few seconds looking at a work of art, especially if it's a popular work of art. You always feel uncomfortable just standing there. And so we may see it, we may take a picture, and then we move on. But you get so much more out of it if you kind of resist that and just stay there and look at it for just a couple of minutes, for 5 minutes. It makes a difference. It's like all of a sudden, wait, I didn't realize I saw that before. Now all these things are coming out when you're observing it. So if you did do this for yourself, or give it as an assignment to your students, to have them stand there, to choose a work and observe it for 5 minutes. And the key to making that more engaging is after a couple of minutes to turn away from it and refresh yourself and then come back. Now, I would imagine, I bet most of you, if not all of you, probably, do something like when you're writing, to step away from your writing for an hour, a few hours, and come back to it. And it's like everything has hit a refresh button. It's the same way with observation, to step away from it and suddenly you see more, you appreciate more. And you can, of course, use what you know to inform your observation, or take some time to bring something with you on your phone. Like a couple of good sites are Mental Floss and Atlas Obscura. Those are both wonderful online magazines that often have articles on art and artists, and maybe to bring some information about the topic that you're integrating with the art, like mental health or LGBTQA or whatnot. And there's one more aspect in terms of observation, and that's the upside down, to bring a new insight into things. This is from artist Guy Deal. He creates very hyper-realistic work. And he said that when he's hit a sticking point on creating a painting, he looks at it in a mirror or upside down because it reveals things you wouldn't see. You're seeing it differently, almost for the first time again. And that's why I've taken Kandinsky's work and turned it upside down and flipped it, just to get a chance, like in a metaphor, to look at something from a new perspective, critical thinking in action. So if in a museum, if you're allowed to do so, to take a picture of a work and then just on your phone or tablet, put it upside down or flip it and see what else can you get out of it now, and engage with it and take advantage of all that emotional engagement and catharsis with these works. Now, I just wanted to mention too about students. Again, unless they're art history students, a lot of them are not used to museums. So in prepping students for such visits, to let them know, like, okay, let's check out and see if there's any accessibility issues. They would need to be warned about any problems, and also about, what challenges there may be, what the costs are, if there happens to be discounts. I know most of the city is good about having a student discount. What services are offered for accessibility, like for neuroatypical students, or in some places like the Met do have good programs for that. And, or for physical accessibility, like if it's an older house type of structure that may not have elevators. And so you'd want to keep that in mind, let them know ahead of time what the experience is like, so that they don't feel lost, and help create new museum lovers. You can even visit it with a perspective, pretend that you are a student visiting it for the first time, so you would know what to tell them when you're sending them on their way. And then just a last little topic here about making artwork. Yes, this is some of my artwork. I like drawing goats. I like drawing pagan goats and cats, and trying to work on some graphic novels. Art, you can engage with art not just by looking at it, but also making it. And that is said to have even more of a beneficial effect for mental health, to create art. And it doesn't have to be great art. I'm certainly not going to say mine is. It just, making art just simply has that effect. And I've experimented with this in classes by having students create something as a final project or part of a final project, whether it's a PowerPoint or a pamphlet. They've made poster boards, they've made flip books, they've made videos, even comic books. And, they enjoyed that because they got to put a little creativity in it, and they engage with the topic more, framing it for what they wanted to do, and also that they got to be a little creative. And museum educators know that one of the best ways to get people engaged while you're in a museum is to give them something a little bit creative to do, because it has this positive change on the brain. And I also wanted to give one last shout out for other forms of art. If you do integrate art in classes or for students, to be expansive about it. When I'm asking my questions of my students about where have you seen critical thinking, or where have you seen ethics in the form of art, I've said, you can use games, you can use comic books, manga, animes, and they're like, oh, okay, well, let me bring up The Last Airbender, and the characters there that I really love. And I get to learn something new, and they get to use something they love. All right, so art need not only be fancy museum art, but it can be, anything that has that positive creative effect. And these are my many sources. You got to have your reference page. And again, I wanted to thank the Dean's Cafe and Professor Letsu and everyone for allowing me this opportunity to make the hard sell on museums and art.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. That was really great. Does anyone have any questions? Well, I might start off with one. So I'm interested in what you think maybe about like clinicalization of medical health. So for example, I've been reading a little bit about like how diagnosis of cancer causes people to have worry about the cancer, right? So that might be, so we're distinguishing the, the physical part of the cancer, right, from the mental part of it. And I'm wondering, like, are by treating mental health, are we telling them you shouldn't be worried about this? Is like, are we saying, if we say this increases worry, and it might be something you should be concerned about, like, are we saying you oughtn't to be worried about that? Like we deal with students, are we telling them, no, you shouldn't be worried about school, even though school will be a source of worry? So I'm wondering, is the clinicalization of mental health, like, can it itself cause harm? I wonder what you think.
I think things should be dealt with realistically, but with encouragement. I mean, I liked your example. Now, I have loved ones who dealt with that very same disease. And it takes a toll because you never know who's going to stick with you and who's going to kind of like, well, I don't know how to deal with that. That they have a serious life-changing disease and leave. So, I think sometimes we're all kind of finding our own way when it comes to that, but being supportive and saying, you know what, I'm here to learn. And with students, I've had, and I think a lot of teachers go through this, I've had students tell me that they were diagnosed with a serious disease. Among other I've had students tell me so much just out of nowhere when they come up and they just, blurt something, and I'm like, okay, I want to listen to you. I think it's good to acknowledge that there's challenges, that it is something to worry about with school, because unless you have everybody in an institution who is there, who is going to help you and say, yes, let's get out there and try to make sure this is good for you, you're going to run into challenges. So I'm saying, like, but just don't give up. Let me do what I can, because I'm a natural problem solver. So whenever somebody says, oh, I'm going through a time, I have to kind of step on the brakes, because not everybody wants their problem solved. Most of the time they just want to be listened to and acknowledged, and to just say, like, yeah, it can be tough. Let's see when you're ready what we can do to help you out for it, but not to kind of say, oh, everything is going to be all right, don't worry. I think sometimes you can't be overly positive, because that isn't always useful.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. Like sometimes, not that they don't want to get better, but they don't want it to be, it's part of who they are. So to tell them, don't worry about that is saying you don't be yourself in a way. So I like how you say you don't have to say, oh, everything will be fine all the time. But it's the kind of a more just listening, letting them be themselves is a good way of approaching
it. It's something that goes to beyond mental health, to just any kind of human experience. Like, the older I get, the more I see how people above a certain age tend not to be listened to in society. And so, just listening and treating a fellow person with respect, to say, like, hey, I'm listening to you. I know it's difficult. It makes an enormous difference, and then when I was talking about LGBTQ topics, this was well over 10 years ago. And, of course, when I was a kid, we didn't have the stuff we do in college now with safe spaces, with gay, straight alliances, nothing. So I had nobody to talk to. But even 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't like it is now. I mean, I know there's a lot of stuff about kids and stuff, that a lot of propaganda out there that is wrongful. But students were some of them were like, I didn't want to hear about this, but, you try to talk about it anyway. And what I mean is like, just one person can make a difference. I tell my students, you never know who is watching you and what you're doing and how you handle a situation. And one person, one kid might be standing out there and looking at you and like, oh, okay. And you may never know you inspired them, but, I would say that is the way to live your life, to be empathetic, to be kind, to listen, and, to be realistic about things, but also encouraging. And to me, that's kind of paying it forward. That's one reason why I wanted to do this. I hope all this stuff made sense. But, it's just like, hey, if there's a little tiny thing to take out of it, then that's great.
I think that's great. Yeah, I think that's great advice for everyone, really. Anyone else have any questions?
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
I was curious by a first question that you asked us about whether we have ever seen or have recently seen a case in movies or books, novels, whatever, of a mental problem misdiagnosed. I mean, that would place a tremendous burden upon me because I don't know enough about mental illness to be able to correctly diagnose a mental illness. Therefore, I would be almost incapable of recognizing when it's not properly represented. I mean, don't you see here a problem, a question like that?
Well, I guess the question is more like if you happen to be familiar with something. I'm thinking of some depictions of anxiety or depression. And, there's been some movie, one of the tropes that likes to be used in movies is that of what I guess they call it now dissociative identity disorder. You can go all the way back to that movie with Edward Norton and Richard Gere, and using it to where Edward Norton was faking it in order to get out of a murder charge. So, it's kind of a question that goes to, I guess, personal experiences where you're like, well, I have anxiety, but that's not really how it's portrayed. Or maybe you see something that is positively portrayed, but a lot of times things are exaggerated, or used for, if not comic effect, then at least used as a requisite bad guy. I mean, maybe even depictions of sociopathy are not correct in movies. And I love movies, but there are ideas to tell a story. So I tend to be aware of tropes when mental health is misused in a creative work.
Well, maybe I was thinking wrongly that you're talking now about whether it's positively or negatively.
Trying to turn the sound down. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I know. I think that was from somewhere else.
There's a difference between saying that something is positively or negatively represented as opposed to correctly or incorrectly. I was thinking of the second.
Okay, I get you.
Very difficult. I mean, look at the difficulty people have in Hamlet to decide whether or not he's insane. It's possible to read this in different ways.
Right. I've read a few books that have looked at movies and said, well, they that were written by therapists or psychologists and said, well, they portrayed this well, with a particular disorder, or they didn't portray that well. And, sometimes it's more like, as I said, like there's so many people who have, a small version of it. Like I'm looking at the news, and the news is very quick to say, somebody's out there, and that people who have any kind of mental illness, even mental illness can be difficult to say, but let's say you have a little bit of anxiety and depression, and you hear in the news, okay, somebody's out there with a mental condition and they're dangerous. That's the number one misconception, that every person who has some form of a mental illness is dangerous, and they're not. That's very rare. And because of that, it becomes a stigma. And then people are less likely to reach out because they're afraid that their friends or family will look negatively on them if they want to just get some therapy.
That is true. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate the question.
All right. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour. If anyone has any additional questions, I'm sure Alex will be happy to maybe discuss on email or anything like that. So again, thank you for joining us today. And I'm hoping you can all join us next time on Thursday, December 7th, when Professor Leonidas Silikos from the Department of Biological and Chemical Sciences will be telling us about some of his ongoing research. And again, I'll post the link again. Don't forget to join our Canvas course so you can view the recording of this and some previous talks. And that's it. So thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Yes, thanks for the.
And of course, thank you again, Alex, for the great talk.
And thank you. Thanks so much. I always appreciate people's time because I know how important time is.
Great. Well, bye everyone.
Thank you.